we're going to jump in this week with a story that the Environmental Protection Agency has proposed new rules that would ease Obama-era regulations on methane emissions that come from oil and gas businesses. And in particular, what it would do is it would get rid of requirements for the industry to install technologies that monitor and limit leaks from new wells, tanks, and pipeline networks, and that would require them to more frequently inspect for leaks. And it would also hold off legal requirements that would have forced the EPA to set rules on emissions from a bunch of pre-existing sites. And the basic logic of this, I think, is pretty sound, which is that if you actually look at the big picture, methane emissions don't seem to be a serious problem that would warrant all of this costly regulation. The Wall Street Journal has a report on this where it points out that oil and gas production, they're making up just a mere 1.2% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and that 1.4% of natural gas pumped from the ground, only 1.4% of natural gas pumped from the ground escapes into the atmosphere. And so you have a situation where it's just not that big a component, even if you are concerned with the impact of greenhouse gases. And then you have a situation where, to the extent that there is a problem, companies already have a pretty big incentive to emit as little as necessary. And of course, sometimes it can be economically necessary to emit, which we've talked about in this show. But as a general rule, you don't gain anything by losing out on the gas that you're trying to bring to the market. So one thing I found interesting about this story is that a lot of the major oil and gas companies have come out opposing loosening these regulations. And it has been observed by a number of people that, it's sort of a win-win for them, at least in the short term, because it allows them to appear green and it allows them to hurt small competitors who can't afford to comply with these kinds of regulations in many cases. And I think that's true, but I think there's another element that reveals why, even if this is a short-term smart move, long-term it's a ridiculously bad move for any oil and gas company. And that is that what inevitably has happened is the Greens have not come out and said, oh man, these oil and gas companies are so brave and courageous and green for opposing Trump on this. What they do say instead is here's a Washington Post headline that really summarizes it. Even the fossil fuel industry doesn't like the EPA's methane rollback. So, the basic pattern is that, the oil and gas companies think that they're going to get credit, but they don't get credit. Instead, you just get their appeasement used to hammer away at anyone who holds out. And this happens all the time, where you just get a pattern of appeasement that doesn't lead to credit, but does lead to using it to undercut holdouts. So, for instance, a few years ago, there was a big move to get the major companies to do climate reports. And once you had some companies that were required to do it and then other companies chose to do it, the main thing that happened is not that these companies that chose to do it were celebrated for really tackling the climate issue. Instead, it was just used in order to pressure all the people who were trying not to do holdouts to say, well, why aren't you doing it? Look, even Exxon's doing it, and XYZ company, they're all doing it too. And this is why I would say that even if the methane rules were in your short-term interest, in the sense that, hey, you were going to benefit while your smaller competitors would not be able to function in that area, you need to be in the premise of defending your freedom and the freedom of your industry to produce, because you don't gain any strategic benefit by engaging in this kind of behavior, but you do hand ammunition to the people whose goal is to put you out of business. Steffen, I know you were paying attention to this story. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so just for a little bit of perspective here, what we are talking about is specifically the U.S. oil and gas industry And as you mentioned, the methane emissions aren't that big a deal in the overall scheme of things for greenhouse gas emissions. But even if you would successfully regulate that domestically in the United States, and that would be a big chunk of the future oil and gas sector, of course, because America is on track or already the biggest oil and gas producer now on the planet since the shale revolution, of course. But what would happen? You would probably make it more costly for oil and gas business in America to comply with these rules, and make some of the producers uncompetitive and get them out of the market. So what would happen then? Would the world stop using fossil fuels? No, probably some Russian gas would come online, or some Kuwaiti gas would come online to replace that supply. And then you would have a higher leakage rate, right? So it's sort of self-defeating in a sense to have too stringent regulations for methane leaks in this way. There's also some talk about redundant rules. There are, of course, state rules that apply to the various basins of shale gas production. And yeah, so there's also, and I can't emphasize this enough, you mentioned the economic trade-off of regulations, right? So yeah, of course, oil and gas producers have an incentive to, gather as much of the methane as they can and not leak a lot, because that's a valuable commodity that they can sell on the market. But sometimes other regulations, for example, pipeline regulations, prevent sufficient capacity to take away natural gas, and then it has to be flared or vented into the atmosphere in order to, not have a build up and a shutdown of the production. And you can see here how many regulations are counterproductive. And the economic point is actually the most important one, because the goal cannot be, the primary goal cannot be to have an absolute zero leakage rate. That's not only is that technically impossible, but also it makes no sense. Right? So you could say, well, there's a certain amount of damage you get from greenhouse gas emissions. If you believe that in the future, some climate damage could be calculated towards a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions. But then you would have to counter that with, how much does it cost to actually prevent that? And the more you prevent something, it typically escalates the cost. So the first 90% of pollution prevention are relatively cheap. Then to get to 99%, it gets exponentially more expensive. And then getting from 99% to 99.9%, that's even more exponentially expensive. So, but that's finally, of course, the goal of the advocates of this kind of rule. They want to make the US producers uneconomic. They want to keep it in the ground. That's their motto. They want to shut it down. They want to shut the production down. They don't want reasonable regulation. And I think the economic argument is the most important of all. And only the industry can really determine, is it worth preventing that last, small amount of emissions from getting out in comparison to the market value of the product. And again, a lot of these regulations, like pipeline regulations and so on, they are actually making things worse because they prevent correct market investment in the right infrastructure to maximize the value of the natural gas.